The raked lines in Kenji Tanaka's Karasansui garden were perfect, each parallel groove in the grey gravel, an exercise in disciplined sorrow. 72 years had etched their own lines onto his face, a landscape of quiet grief, but it was here, in this small walled world in Kamakura, that he sought a semblance of order against the encroaching chaos of loneliness. Autumn's chill, a familiar precursor to winter's deeper solitude, seeped into the old wooden house, a house that still whispered with the ghost of Aiko, his wife of 45 years. 5 years she'd been gone, and the silence she left behind was a living thing, vast and unyielding. His morning ritual was precise. The careful sweep of the angawa, the preparation of a single serving of rice and miso soup, the lighting of incense before Aiko's small butsudan. The fragrant smoke curled upwards, carrying unspoken words, a daily communion with memory. Today, like most days, the silence was broken only by the distant caw of a crow and the rustle of maple leaves, their fiery colours a stark contrast to the monochrome of his existence. The phone jangled, an intrusion. It was Emmy, his daughter. Her voice, always tinged with a gentle anxiety, inquired about his health, the garden, the changing weather. "I'm well, Emmy. The chrysanthemums are late this year," he said, his tone level, unrevealing. "Papa, you should get out more. The walking group, or perhaps the temple has some events." He deflected with practiced ease. "The garden requires attention, and the quiet suits me." It was a half-truth. The quiet was also a heavy blanket, smothering. After the call, he changed into a sombre jacket and walked the familiar path to the local temple where Aiko rested. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. He poured fresh water over the cool stone, arranged the flowers he'd brought, and stood for a long time, his hands clasped. What did one say to memory? The ache in his chest was a constant companion, a dull throb of absence. Weeks later, an unexpected nudge came from Mrs. Ito, a neighbour whose cheerfulness often felt like a minor assault on his carefully curated peace. "Tanaka-san, you missed the most fascinating lecture series at the community centre. Local history. And there's this lady, Hayashi-san, asks such intelligent questions. You'd enjoy the intellectual stimulation, I'm sure." He'd murmured a polite refusal, retreating into his shell. But Mrs. Ito's words, a tiny seed, had found fertile ground in his loneliness. One afternoon, the weight of an empty house pressing down on him, he found himself walking towards the community centre. He slipped into the back row just as the lecture began. His eyes scanned the attendees, mostly retirees like himself. Then he saw her, a woman with a serene composure, her silver hair neatly coiffed, listening intently. When the Q&A started, she posed a question about the ancient trade routes of Kamakura, her voice clear and thoughtful. Fumiko Hayashi. He recognized the name from Mrs. Ito's chatter. Their eyes met for a fleeting second as she sat down. He gave a barely perceptible nod, she a polite, almost invisible inclination of her head. It was nothing, a ripple in the still pond of his day. Yet, as he walked home, the image of her quiet intelligence lingered, a faint, unexpected scent in the autumn air. Winter settled over Kamakura, its short days and long nights amplifying Kenji's solitude. The Karasansui lay under a thin veil of frost, its patterns stark and unyielding. He'd almost forgotten the brief encounter at the lecture when, seeking refuge from his own thoughts in the hushed aisles of the local library, he saw her again. Fumiko Hayashi was perusing a shelf of classic Japanese literature. This time, a chance meeting felt less like an accident and more like a gentle nudge from an unseen hand. "Hayashi-san?" he ventured, his voice rusty from disuse. She turned, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "Tanaka-san? Good afternoon." A polite conversation unfolded, surprisingly easy. They discovered a shared appreciation for Kawabata and the quiet melancholy of old Enoshima prints. Fumiko, he learned, had been a librarian before her retirement. Her grief for a husband lost suddenly to a heart attack 3 years prior was different from his own prolonged vigil with Aiko's illness, yet a thread of understanding wove between them. "Perhaps," she said as they parted, her gaze direct yet gentle, "we could share tea sometime, Tanaka-san, if you're not too busy." The suggestion hung in the air. Kenji, a man who measured his days in solitary routines, felt a jolt of something akin to panic, quickly followed by an unfamiliar stirring of anticipation. He mumbled an assent, his mind already cataloguing the disruptions this would entail. Their initial meetings were exercises in cautious formality. They chose quiet tea houses, their conversations chaperoned by the clinking of porcelain and the aroma of sencha. Kenji listened more than he spoke, absorbing Fumiko's quiet observations about the changing seasons, a new exhibition at the museum, or a passage from a book she was reading. He learned she had a son living abroad and a daughter in Kyoto. She was patient with his silences, never pressing, her presence a calm pool rather than a demanding tide. Slowly, incrementally, Kenji found himself looking forward to these encounters. The hours spent with Fumiko were islands of muted color in the grey expanse of his days, yet each step forward was shadowed by a step back into the labyrinth of his anxieties. The ghost of Aiko was a constant companion. He'd catch himself comparing Fumiko's gentle laugh to Aiko's more robust one, Fumiko's thoughtful pauses to Aiko's effusive warmth. Guilt, sharp and cold, would pierce him. Was he betraying Aiko's memory by finding solace in another's company? Flashbacks to Aiko's final months, the sterile smell of the hospital, the rasp of her breathing, his own bone-deep wariness as her caregiver would surface unbidden, reinforcing his fear of future dependencies, of witnessing, or worse, causing, such suffering again. He mentioned Fumiko tentatively to his children. Ryo, his engineer son in Tokyo, responded with pragmatic suspicion during their next video call. Fumiko Hayashi, is she financially stable, father? What are her circumstances? Have you considered the implications for your will, for the family grave? His questions were like carefully aimed darts, each one finding a vulnerable spot in Kenji's fragile hope. Emi's reaction was softer, steeped in a wistful sadness. Oh, Papa, that's unexpected. I'm glad you're not so alone, but it feels so strange. I keep thinking, what would Mama say? Her voice trembled, and Kenji felt a fresh wave of guilt, this time for unsettling his daughter's carefully preserved image of her parents' perfect union. Ryo, true to his nature, announced he was coming to Kamakura to discuss things properly. The visit was a formal affair, conducted in the tatami room where Aiko had once presided over family gatherings. Ryo, stiff in his city suit, spoke of duty, of protecting the family legacy, the house, which had been in the Tanaka name for generations, the Ohaka, where Aiko lay. One must be practical, father, he'd said, his gaze unwavering. At your age, emotional decisions can have serious consequences. This woman, one must be sure of her intentions. The implication, unspoken but clear, was that Kenji was being naive, perhaps even foolish. Kenji listened, his heart a cold knot, offering little defense beyond quiet assertions of Fumiko's respectability. The conversation left him feeling diminished, his nascent hope bruised. With Fumiko, however, a different kind of honesty began to bloom. One afternoon, walking through the grounds of Kotoku Inn, the great Buddha serene and impassive before them, they spoke more openly of their lost spouses. Fumiko described the suddenness of her husband's death, the shock that had left her adrift. Kenji, in turn, haltingly recounted the slow, painful erosion of Aiko's illness. Sharing these burdens, these sacred griefs, forged a deeper connection. They were two ships, long battered by storms, finding a quiet harbour in each other's understanding. Then a minor health scare. Kenji, reaching for a book on a high shelf, felt a wave of dizziness and stumbled, catching himself just before a serious fall. He was alone, and the incident, though minor, terrified him. The fear of helplessness, of becoming a burden, was a cold spectre. Fumiko learned of it indirectly from Mrs. Ito and called, her voice filled with genuine concern. She offered to bring him groceries, to check in. Her kindness was a balm, yet it also pricked his deepest anxieties. He politely declined, insisting he was fine, but her solicitude touched a chord of gratitude he hadn't expected. They began to visit each other's homes. Fumiko's apartment, smaller and more modern than his sprawling traditional house, was filled with books, art, and an abundance of thriving potted plants. It exuded a lived-in warmth, a gentle intellectual clutter that Kenji found both inviting and slightly overwhelming. In contrast, Fumiko, on her first visit to his home, was visibly moved by its serene beauty, the meticulous garden, the carefully preserved artifacts of Aiko's life. "It's like a perfect museum, Kenji-san," she'd said softly, her words carrying a subtle question. He understood. His home was a shrine to the past, every object a testament to Aiko. There was little space, physical or emotional, for new life. The unspoken challenge of merging two such deeply entrenched existences loomed large, a silent mountain range between them. Winter held them in its grip, the path forward shrouded in mist. Spring arrived in Kamakura with a tentative, fragile beauty. Plum blossoms scattered their pale pink confetti on the temple grounds, and the air, though still crisp, carried the promise of warmth. For Kenji, the change of seasons mirrored an internal thawing. The heavy cloak of his grief, while still present, felt a little lighter. He found himself anticipating his meetings with Fumiko not with anxiety, but with a quiet pleasure. He even caught himself smiling at some shared observation, a subtle shift in the landscape of his face that had been absent for years. Emi visited with her 2 young children, a whirlwind of youthful energy that briefly filled the silent rooms of Kenji's house. The grandchildren, with their innocent laughter and boundless curiosity, were a fleeting joy. But Emi herself was strained. She was overly solicitous of Kenji's comfort, yet a wall of polite avoidance descended whenever the unspoken name of Fumiko hovered in the air. The visit, meant to comfort, subtly underscored the complexities of blending families, of introducing a new person into a long-established dynamic. One afternoon, Kenji and Fumiko found themselves in a rare moment of discord. It was a small thing, a difference of opinion on a political issue, or perhaps a misunderstanding about a planned outing. Kenji, accustomed to Aiko's intuitive understanding of his moods, had retreated into a stubborn silence. Fumiko, more direct, gently pressed for clarification. The conversation was awkward, punctuated by uncomfortable pauses, but they navigated it. Fumiko did not placate, she sought understanding. Kenji, forced to articulate his unease, found a measure of release. It was a crucial lesson. This new companionship would require a different kind of communication, a more conscious effort than the well-worn paths of his long marriage. The true storm broke with a phone call from Rio. His voice, usually controlled, now carried an edge of ultimatum. "Father, I've heard you're seeing Hayashi-san quite regularly. I must insist, for your own protection and for the families, that you consult a lawyer before things become more complicated. One must ensure there are no misunderstandings about assets, about the house. The implication that Fumiko might have ulterior motives, that his own judgment was so impaired, cut Kenji to the core. He ended the call, his hand trembling, a profound weariness settling over him. The weight of his children's expectations, his own fears, and the fragile hope Fumiko represented pressed down on him. He knew he couldn't continue in this limbo. He arranged to meet Fumiko at Hasadera Temple, its famous Kannon statue, a symbol of compassion, its hillside perch offering a sweeping view of the turbulent spring sea. The air was cool, carrying the salty tang of the ocean. They walked in silence for a while, the weight of unspoken thoughts heavy between them. Then, looking out at the grey, restless waves, Kenji began to speak. He laid bare his fears, Rio's pragmatism that felt like accusation, Emi's sorrow that felt like a gentle reproach, his terror of illness, of becoming a burden, of failing another person he cared for. He spoke of Aiko, of the deep, abiding loyalty that felt like a betrayal if he sought happiness elsewhere. Fumiko listened, her gaze steady, empathetic. When he finally fell silent, she spoke, her voice soft but firm. She shared her own anxieties, the fear of losing the independence she had painstakingly rebuilt, the quiet dread of not being truly accepted by his children, the echoes of past hurts from her own life. She didn't offer easy reassurances or dismiss his concerns. She acknowledged the complexities, the very real challenges the original article had outlined: health, finances, family, ingrained habits, emotional baggage. "Kenji-san," she said, her eyes meeting his, "we both carry our pasts like carefully wrapped bundles. The question is not whether we can discard them, but whether we can find a way to walk forward, carrying them side by side, without letting their weight crush the path ahead. Perhaps what we are seeking is not a replacement for what we lost, but something new, something carefully built for who we are now, in this autumn of our lives." Her words, devoid of sentimentality, yet filled with a profound understanding, resonated deep within him. They didn't solve anything, yet they cleared a space for possibility. Later that week, Kenji made a solitary pilgrimage to Aiko's grave. The spring sunlight filtered through the new leaves, dappling the moss-covered stones. He didn't ask for permission or forgiveness. He spoke to her in his heart, a long, rambling monologue of his loneliness, his confusion, his tentative, flickering hope for a companionship that might ease the ache. As he stood to leave, a sense of quiet peace, fragile but real, settled over him. It wasn't an answer, but an acceptance that loving Aiko did not preclude him from seeking warmth in the winter of his life. Summer arrived, bringing with it a humid warmth and the vibrant chorus of cicadas. Kenji, armed with the clarity he'd found at Aiko's grave and the quiet strength of Fumiko's words, knew he had to speak to his children, not as a supplicant, but as a man making a conscious choice for his own well-being. He met Ryo in Tokyo, in a neutral cafe away from the charged atmosphere of either home. He spoke calmly, firmly. He explained his profound loneliness, his deep respect for Aiko's memory, and his decision to cultivate a deep companionship with Fumiko. "It will not be a conventional remarriage, Ryo," he stated. "Not immediately, perhaps not ever. We will define it ourselves. But I will not spend my remaining years in solitude if there is a chance for warmth and understanding." He acknowledged Ryo's concerns about practical matters, but asserted his right to make his own decisions about his life and happiness. Ryo listened, his usual pragmatic arguments softened by a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, perhaps surprise at his father's resolve, perhaps a grudging respect. He remained skeptical, but the overt opposition receded. "As long as you are careful, father," was his final non-committal remark. The conversation with Emmy was more emotional. He visited her in her suburban home, the scent of her baking filling the air. Over tea, he spoke to her gently, echoing his words to Ryo, but tailoring them to her sensitive nature. He reassured her that Aiko would always be her mother, her memory sacred. He spoke of Fumiko not as a replacement, but as a companion for this different chapter of his life. Emmy cried, a mixture of old grief and new understanding. "I just want you to be happy, Papa," she whispered, her voice thick with tears, "and not to be taken advantage of." It was a fragile acceptance, but it was a start. Kenji and Fumiko, free from the immediate pressure of familial disapproval, discussed their future with open eyes. They decided against the upheaval of immediate cohabitation or the legal complexities of formal marriage. Instead, they chose to cultivate their companionship deliberately, like a carefully tended garden. They established regular days to spend together, sometimes at his house, sometimes at hers. They discovered a shared enjoyment in attending local craft fairs, exploring Kamakura's less visited temples, and even attempting a pottery class, their initial efforts comically misshapen. Fumiko, with her love for growing things, gently persuaded Kenji to allow a few flowering plants onto his austere veranda, small bursts of colour against the grey gravel of his Karasansui. They maintained their separate homes as anchors of independence, private spaces where they could retreat and recharge, but their lives became increasingly intertwined, a tapestry woven with threads of shared experiences and mutual support. They maintained their separate homes as anchors of independence, private spaces where they could retreat and recharge, but their lives became increasingly intertwined, a tapestry woven with threads of shared. If one had a doctor's appointment, the other often accompanied them. They read the same books and discussed them, their intellectual companionship a quiet joy. The final